There's a lot I don't know about Ellis Harold Hendricks, but what I do know, I'm going to tell you right now. He was born on June 4th, 1916, the ninth of 14 children. Just a farm boy from Lexington, South Carolina, but everybody called him Chief, even the president. Here's an excerpt of the story about how he got to the White House. In 1934, a year after he graduated from high school, he braved the Big Apple and went to St. Vincent's Nursing School that had just opened its doors to educate men in that field. In 1937, he headed to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, to further his education and specialize in physical therapy. When the draft board became seemingly anxious about his absence in the military, he chose to choose before they chose for him, and he enlisted in the U.S. Navy. In 1943, he found himself in New London, Connecticut for basic submarine training and spent the next 10 years underwater. On the submarine, he became proficient at sound navigation and ranging, earned a Bronze Star Medal using sonar to successfully navigate through minefields in the Pacific. During one of the many delicate and dangerous missions, an emergency dive rendered the submarine and those on it disorientated. In order to regain control, Ellis cupped his hands for his shipmate's foot to use as leverage so he could reach the controls, backing to the surface, then slowly changing the angle for hours until they leveled off to safety. He spent 6 years on War Patrol, 4 on the USS Dace, 2 on the USS Runner, which was part of the chosen squadron that was within eye distance of the USS Missouri when Japan surrendered and the peace treaty was signed at the end of World War II. He continued to serve during the Korean War. When he got his land legs back, his first assignment was at the Naval Dispensary on Connecticut Avenue in downtown Washington, D.C. This brought him in contact with many foreign and domestic dignitaries, senators, cabinet members, allowed him to watch Harry Truman play poker on the presidential yacht Williamsburg, and put a Band-Aid on Dwight Eisenhower at Camp David. On January 20th, 1961, John F. Kennedy was sworn in as the 35th President of the United States. The Navy was chosen to provide medical care to the President and the First Family. Commanding officer of the Naval Dispensary, Admiral George Berkeley, was to be Kennedy's primary care physician. Berkeley asked Ellis to be his assistant, knowing he specialized in physical therapy, and because Kennedy had well-known back problems from his 1943 PT-109 boat accident. For the next 2 years and 306 days, Ellis worked long and loyal hours, tirelessly attending to the president's well-being. Starting at 7 a.m., charts were checked from the day before, and by 8 a.m., he would be escorted to the president's private quarters, where blood pressure was taken, back treatments were administered, and weight was checked to confirm there was no water retention, as Kennedy had an adrenal deficiency. To help combat his back issues, Kennedy swam religiously twice a day, once at noon and late in the evening. Frequently, when Kennedy had an invited guest at the pool, he would ask if they had one of his signature PT boat tie clips. If they didn't, he would just reach over and grab Ellis's, the one he was wearing, and tell Ellis to get another one from his secretary, Mrs. Lincoln. Kennedy traveled extensively, and wherever he went, Ellis went too. Weekends were often spent in Williamsburg, Virginia. Once, when Ellis brought his wife, Jean, little Caroline asked after a conversation with Jean, "Chief, why do you keep secrets from your wife?" Ellis replied, "Well, I don't think I do, but why do you ask?" Caroline said, because I just asked her what you did for my father, and she said, I have no idea. Thanksgivings were spent at the Kennedy Cape Cod compound and in Newport, Rhode Island. On one occasion, Kennedy went sailing Friday morning, and when he got back, he said, Chief, I'm feeling great. I don't think I'll need you this weekend. Go home and be with your family. See if you can catch the courier plane back. Ellis hastily made the arrangements and arrived home. About a half hour later, the phone rang. It was the president. Chief, I slipped on the boat and I hurt my back. Do you think you can catch the courier plane back? On the trip back, though, a nor'easter was coming in. The courier plane was caught in a crosswind, and Ellis remembered, he said, you should have seen those sailors ducking for cover when we flew in for the landing. On a trip to Puerto Rico and South America, the running water in the hotel was brown, causing Kennedy to be late getting ready for the event. Ellis found some distilled water so he could brush his teeth and wash his face, but in the rush, Kennedy had left important papers on the bed. Ellis called the Secret Service, asking for someone to come up and take control of the situation. The Secret Service man was unable to leave his station, so Ellis got to be Secret Service for the night. There was not an exact protocol when traveling because Kennedy made more trips than any president had before him, but Ellis usually traveled on Air Force One with him. During a trip to Caracas, Ellis was bumped to the press plane, which usually raced to get to the destination ahead of the president. Kennedy noticed Ellis was missing as he asked for him when Air Force One was landing. The next day, as they were getting ready to depart, Kennedy asked Ellis if he was riding on Air Force One that day, to which Ellis replied, no, sir, I'll be on the press plane. Kennedy said that he and Jackie would both feel better if he was on Air Force One. And he called one of the captains over and explained the predicament. And looking at the captain, he asked, do you have any idea who I should bump? This is one of the very few times that a CPO bumped a captain off of a presidential plane. Kennedy also traveled with a special orthopedic mattress, which one time, due to all the extra equipment, needed to go in the backup plane, which actually never made it to the destination. Ellis called the local VA to see if he could get one issued. However, the VA supply officer was not going to give up their government equipment to just anybody. Ellis called back and asked to speak to the officer above him and was told to send the car and the mattress would be ready immediately. There were so many more stories, but then there was Dallas. A few days before Dallas, Ellis was at the pool as the president was drying off after a late night swim and asked, oh, Chief, are you making the trip to Dallas with me? No, sir, I was planning to assign that trip to Tom Mills unless you have other wishes. Kennedy replied, no, I wouldn't want to hurt Tom's feelings. And he said goodnight and he left. A few minutes later, he came back and said, Chief, do you think you could explain to Mills? Of course, Mr. President. Otherwise, Ellis would not have gone. The night before President Kennedy was assassinated, Ellis was in his private quarters, about ready to leave after giving him his back treatment. It was almost 11 p.m. Kennedy loved shows about nature and was watching one on the Emperor Penguin. Chief, sit down and watch this with me, he said. So he did. And the news came on, and Kennedy was getting a kick out of the amount of difficulty the newscaster was having in reporting the news that night. But after a while, Ellis said, if there's nothing else, sir, I'll be going. He walked out of the room into a small foyer, and when he got to the double doors that led out to the hotel hallway, he heard a voice, and he turned to see the president standing in the doorway with his nightshirt on, saying, thanks very much, Chief, and good night. And that was the last time the president would speak to my Uncle Ellis. When asked if Kennedy suffered any pain, Chief Medical Officer Ellis Hendricks was quoted in the book the death of a president as saying, no, death was instantaneous. Ellis and JFK were coworkers who spent significant amounts of time with each other every day. They were both middle-aged men raising small children in a world that was starting to unravel. Ellis was so very fond of Kennedy and so devastated by the loss that even years later, just the mention of the word Dallas could bring tears to his eyes. He spent weekends weeping in the country for months following the death. He worked for Johnson for a while, retiring from the service in 1964, settled down in Teaneck, New Jersey, and worked for Dr. Hans Kraus in Manhattan. Kraus was sometimes known as JFK's secret doctor, as he was known for pioneering new ways of treating back problems. In 2019, I was working with veterans through Right Face and found myself in an assisted living facility in Landisville talking to Alex Melleby, a 95-year-old Army veteran that I had never met before, who at one time worked for the Y in New York City and had written a book for their new program, The Y's Way to a Healthy Back. He sought out Dr. Hans Kraus to write the foreword for the book, which incidentally my Aunt Jean probably typed. Melleby and Kraus became good friends. I was stunned. When I asked him if he knew Ellis Hendricks, he got a big smile on his face and said, "Of course, I knew the chief." As a kid, I didn't call him chief. I called him Uncle Ellis. He was my great uncle, kind, gentle, quiet, and unassuming as he went about his business, always in a pair of black trousers and a button-down shirt. Once, when I went camping with he and my Aunt Jean and my cousins, I was homesick, sobbing in my tent in the middle of the night. He crawled out of his tent to see if I was okay. He startled me so that I snapped at him and I said, "I'm fine." Years later, when time was starting to steal his memory, we were at a family gathering, and things got quiet for a second. And in his sweet, slightly Southern accent, he said, "Annie, are you homesick?" I am. I'm homesick and heartsick, because as a kid, I didn't know what a treasure we had in him, but I do now, and so do you.